Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I have a bit of a Dungeons & Dragons video. But with that being said, this really will work for any type of TTRPG that involves kings, royalty, whatever. Now, what I'm going to be discussing here is 9 archetypes of kings I use in my Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Now understand, as I'm explaining this, that this is kind of along the lines of what type of personality traits do they have? Do they listen to their advisors? How do they run their state, etc.? Of course, you can mix and match these. This is just kind of like baseline profiles for these types of canes that I have. And they seem to work pretty good for me because it 9 personalities or 9 archetypes, if you will, kind of really spans out for what type of canes I have within my campaign, and understand that this is what I do for my campaign and that it seems to work pretty good. So let's start with the first one, and the first one I'm going to start with is the ruler, which I feel Aragorn is a good possibility of a ruler. I like to imagine that he is the ruler, or a ruler, if you will, at least after Return of the Cane. And essentially, the idea of the ruler is he's the fairest king in the land. He rules his kingdom with a fair hand, and he tries to keep things as balanced as he can. He may not be the wisest or the smartest of kings, but he's pretty average on that end. And he is more than willing to trust and listen to his advisors, especially good advisors. He is a hard figure to corrupt because he believes in balance and likes to keep it that way. When it comes to ruling the kingdom itself, he is a very active ruler within his kingdom. He tries to take as much in as he can and tries to understand everyone's pains, everyone's grievances, and he tries to figure out the best ways to handle those situations. He is a king that would not be quick and easy to go to war. He would rather expend various options of coming up with peace over going to war, but he is also not above going to war. And when wartime comes, he may or may not actually be on the front lines of the battlefield. In the case of Aragorn, he was in the front and center of the battlefield, which the ruler would feel is important. And that is because he doesn't just see himself as the king, he sees himself as a symbol of hope and leadership and morale, which, militarily speaking, is important. Now, when it comes to certain habits, he is not one to actually drink very often. He is not a drunkard, if you will, but he will drink socially and celebrate socially. When it comes to speaking to his people, he is very charismatic, and his people trust him. Of all the kings, the ruler is probably the most well-respected and well-rounded of the kings. And when essentially I want a really good king, this is the type of personality trait or archetype I use, if you will. With that being said, we're going to move on to the next one. And that is the Wise King. The Wise King kind of shapes out elves the most, or at least in my world, kind of shapes out elves. But sometimes you get human canes and dwarven canes that are the wise archetype. And essentially, these are canes that are extremely wise. They are very intelligent, have a lot of wisdom. They share a lot of personality traits, if you will, to the ruler. But a lot of people feel that the wise king is definitely wise beyond their years. They use their wisdom to rule the kingdom, and they always look for the most obvious solution to any problems that arises within the kingdom. Now, with that being said, when it comes to the state of the military, the wise king keeps a powerful military at his disposal, but he is not quick to go to war. And with that being said, he also tries to avoid actually being involved in the battlefield, but it is not surpassed the Wise King to actually be on the battlefield, most likely being in the back lines, speaking with his generals about the best directions to go when it comes to commencing warfare. But with that being said, he typically does not go on the battlefield. He has very similar drinking habits in the sense of he drank socially, not a drunkard type of king. These kings are not easy to corrupt, and I would say it's almost impossible to corrupt these kings because once again, they rule their kingdom with wisdom, and they prefer to keep things as balanced as possible. So, with that being said, it would be hard to corrupt the wise king. Now, when it comes to matters of state, he definitely takes a very deep interest in the matters of state. He cares about his infrastructure, he cares about his people, and he tries to come up with the best solutions he can for any types of problems that comes up. Anyway, folks, let's move on to the next one. And that is the righteous king. King Arthur, I feel, fills the spot of being the righteous king, a righteous king. These are very religious kings. They are very similar to the ruler in many regards, but instead of ruling with wisdom and intelligence, they essentially rule by using righteous will, if you will. They kind of do what they believe their gods would want them to do. Everything is done with religious intent, especially in the states of warfare. When it comes to ruling his people, he rules his people with a fair and even hand. When it comes to matters of state, he does take a pretty personal interest in the matters of state, but more often than not, he takes very close interest in the matters of war. Yes, I know while King Arthur was a religious king, King Arthur was a wartime king. And also, everything he does, or everything that happens to him and his kingdom, is through God's will, whatever that God is. Of course, for King Arthur, it would be God. These kings tend to not drink. They very modestly, celebration-wise, meals, things of that nature. But these kings are also not drunkards. These are pretty straight kings. Within a kingdom that has a strict religious, these kingdoms will have strict religious codes, and the king wants his people to follow those strict religious codes. Like I said, he is very strict and very religious, or very strict when it comes to religion, if you will. But other than that, there's not a whole lot more to say about the religious king. Now, the next archetype I will talk about is the Conqueror. And actually, King Longshanks, as well, that was his nickname, but King Longshanks would be the Conqueror. Also, King Conan would be the Conqueror. These are kings who edged out their kingdom through bloodshed and warfare. These kings are very strict. They have a very strong, tight military, and as long as their kingdom is at war, they actually have generally a good economy. However, with that being said, the Conqueror also realizes too that any long-term warfare does not do his kingdom any good. When it comes to matters of state, he does pay attention, but he doesn't necessarily have the deepest of interest. So he's going to rely on any advisors more than anything else when it comes to the matters of state. However, when it comes to matters of warfare, he will listen to his generals, but essentially he will actually is the last voice when it comes to committing to any type of planned warfare or tactics or strategy. The wartime king doesn't necessarily do much in the way of drinking, and he prefers something along the lines of hunting. something that provides additional excitement as a pastime. He is not a real big fan of sitting in the throne room and having people kiss his ass. Instead, he is more of a doer. He wants to go out on the battlefield. He wants to conquer. He wants to expand his lands. He wants to maintain what he keeps. So he keeps a strong military presence anywhere possible, especially in important locations and border cities and towns. He is not one to quickly go to war, though. However, he is not above declaring war. He does demand respect, and he does demand high discipline of his men and anyone beneath him. All right, I'm going to wrap up that one. Let's move on to the next one. And the next one is kind of a variation of the Conqueror, and that is the Veteran. And actually, I feel Robert Baratheon edges out the Veteran really well. The Veteran is essentially the Conqueror, whose conquering days are behind them. They no longer can really go on the battlefield due to health reasons, mental instability, or just being a flat-out alcoholic, in the case of Robert Baratheon. Of course, his weight and other issues didn't help him either. These are Canes that have seen war, lots of war, and honestly probably suffers from something similar to PTSD, which is probably why they drink so much. And that is actually one staple they do. These Canes are drunkards. They do not have any interest in ruling from the throne room, and they find anything that gives them excitement that is not involved in the throne room. With that being said, they also don't really go to warfare themselves personally because, well, essentially, they're not healthy enough for warfare. And they acknowledge that. That's why the Veteran is different from the Conqueror. The Veteran doesn't step on the battle, even though the Veteran doesn't step on the battlefield, he does listen very closely to his military advisors as well as his spies and any type of intelligence he gains. He will take great interest in what is going on during war while his kingdom is at war. When it comes to the matters of state, though, he just kind of sits there and nods his head because he is completely disinterested. The Veteran, more often than not, is the person that is a king by essentially their own hand or because there was no one better to be the king, I guess you could say. In the case of Robert Baratheon, he was the leader of a rebellion to kill a tyrant king. And then he himself, when the war was over, became king. And essentially, he was disinterested in being a king. Now, with that being said, he does demand respect, although he doesn't really have to demand it as much as it's just given to him for what he has done. People acknowledge his military service, and people acknowledge that he was some type of hero during whatever war he was involved in. And honestly, when he is sober, he does pay attention to matters of state, and he does expect strict discipline among his troops, military, and advisors. But he doesn't always necessarily pay attention either, which is one of his downfalls. He is not necessarily corruptible as much as he is just uninterested, which could let corruption in within his kingdom. And that is a problem within itself. Once again, things that will take interest for him is going to be things that is combat related or hunting related. He likes to have and watch jousting tourneys. He likes to have and watch other types of tournaments. Any types of tournaments that involves basically warfare in some way or another. When he is not at tournaments and not stuck in the throne room, he is either out drinking and whoring or boar hunting, whichever takes his interest the most, or at least at that moment. With that being said, he is not a king that necessarily wants or needs to be pampered, nor does he want or need to be reminded that he is the king. Actually, if anything, he would probably hang someone who reminds him that he is the king. Unless, basically court things makes people remind him that he's the king, but whatever. Anyway, let's move on to the next one, and the next one is the charismatic. Now, this is probably going to be the first of the corruptible kings, but let's dive on into it here. The charismatic king is essentially the face and the voice of the kingdom. He is not necessarily a fair ruler, but he is charismatic, and his people love him for it. He is not necessarily the prettiest man in the kingdom, but most likely he is the prettiest man in the kingdom, or at least one of them. When it comes to matters of state, he is not necessarily interested, but he will take more interest in the matters of state than the veteran and the conqueror, especially if it gains him more fame. And that is the bottom line for this type of king. Everything is about his charisma and about his fame. When it comes to the matters of the military, he's pretty much disinterested. As long as his generals are fighting a war and they're winning the war, he will not pay attention. However, the moment that his general starts failing, then he will start to pay very close attention. When it comes to discipline, he doesn't necessarily care, but those closest to him he will demand discipline from. And that is because of his outer image, if you will. The charismatic king tends to be a bit greedy, and that is actually where he is corruptible. Essentially, for him, anything that gains him fame or riches, he is interested, and he can be corrupted because of this. However, with that being said, he may not necessarily be the easiest to corrupt. He doesn't necessarily take any interest in anything like tournaments, although he will acknowledge his people do. When it comes to his drinking habits, well, he is a drinker. He likes his wine. Most of them do. And they like to party, and he likes pretty women around him, even if the queen has to sit there and watch. Anyway, while that went kind of sidetracked, let's move on to the next one, and that is the greedy. This king, actually, this is a common one I use for dwarves, although I've used this one quite a bit for humans as well. And essentially the greedy is, well, he's a greedy king. He wants gold, he wants riches, he wants jewels. When it comes to the matters of state and the matters of the military, he actually pays pretty close attention because he wants to know where his money is going. And he always wants to make sure his books are in the green. The moment his books end up in the red, heads start to roll because that means he is losing wealth. Now, when it comes to clothing, his throne room, etc., everything is extravagant. At the end of the day, everything about this king is about money, and thus he is corruptible. The more money he can get, the easier he is to corrupt. However, with that being said, if he thinks there's a possibility that he will lose money, then he is not corruptible, because money is the only thing that he is interested in, the shining of gold and diamonds. The next one here I'm going to discuss is the coward, and I feel this is a perfect example of Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Although, with that being said, Joffrey would have definitely grew up to be the Tyrant, which is going to be the next one. But let's get into it. The coward is essentially the most cowardly king. He doesn't necessarily take any interest in the state or his military, and actually he avoids the military as much as possible. Even when forced onto the battlefield, he is likely to run away. He is reluctant on giving orders because most of the time he has inexperience. The coward, it tends to be a young king and usually has either a veteran or conqueror as a father. These canes are typically put into position at a very young age, basically mid to late teenage years, and they are not very competent canes. Actually, more often than not, they are incompetent canes. They will listen to their statesmen, they will listen to their advisors, and they will tend to do what their statesmen and advisors advise. However, sometimes when they go to make a decision, they will dig in their heels and not change their mind, even if their advisors are clearly right. They have little to no respect for others. Their power is, or their interest is sitting on the throne with the crown on their head, ruling his people, and essentially bossing them around. And essentially, it's to look tough, even though he's a coward. Now, with that being said, the cowardly king can be corrupted, mostly because they can be tricked, at least if the person is good enough who's trying to do it. Also, with that being said, when it comes to things such as money, they are a quite bit greedy. Not as greedy as the greedy king, but yes, they are still greedy. Now, behind closed doors, these canes tend to be a bit sadist and almost tyrannical. And that is because they're cowards. They are trying to overcompensate for their cowardice. And usually these canes, sometimes these canes are older, but usually these canes are younger, and they tend to grow into either staying as a cowardly cane or growing into the Tyrant, which is the one I'm moving on to next. King Henry VIII, I believe. The tyrannical king. These kings are tyrants. They rule their kingdoms with an iron fist. When it comes to the matters of state, they draw close attention. And whenever they put their foot down on a decision, that is final, or heads will roll. When it comes to the interest of the military, they will take close interest in their military. However, with that being said, that does not mean they are competent at military action, as such as the veteran or the conqueror. They have no problems eating and drinking and whoring until they're content. When it comes to discipline, well, it's simple. This is the tyrant. He rules with an iron hand, and he expects the utmost discipline of anyone beneath him. He expects more discipline from them than he actually shows himself. He is not above reminding people that he is the king, and most often the way he does that is by ordering executions, sometimes by the bushels. Now, when it comes to being corruptible, he is fairly corruptible, but he is not the most corruptible. He is not as corrupt as the cowardly king, but the tyrant can be pretty corruptible as long as he thinks he's going to gain power, and that is his driving force. So think of this as the greedy king, but power over money. However, that being said, when it comes to the states of money, he wants to see the books in the green. Because if he sees them in the red, that means he's losing money, and that means something isn't going right. But anyway, folks, that is my video on 9 different archetypes of kings that I run. And these are just, understand, these are just baseline. They're kind of what I use to kind of edge out what a cane is, and then I'll fill it in more, or I'll make little tweaks, so on and so forth. But there you go, folks. That's how I do it. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.